Every barrel of oil tells a story, and every gallon of fuel that moves through a pipeline before it reaches an American refinery starts its journey in Canada. More than 4 million barrels of crude oil cross that border every single day, which makes Canada the largest foreign supplier of oil to the United States. No other energy partnership carries more weight for either country's economy. Then Donald Trump stepped forward with a message that immediately caught everyone's attention. Standing in front of reporters, he claimed that America didn't need anything Canada had. Not its energy, not its resources, not even its oil. He insisted that Canada depended on the United States far more than the United States depended on Canada. But only a short time later, his own administration made a request that told a completely different story. Washington formally demanded guaranteed, discounted, long-term access to Canadian crude oil. Mark Carney rejected that request without hesitation, and his response echoed far beyond Ottawa. It reached energy ministries, pipeline operators, commodity traders, and financial markets around the world. When the country supplying more than 4 million barrels of oil a day tells its biggest customer that the request goes too far, people take notice. Canada wasn't rejecting diplomacy. It was refusing what it saw as an attempt to gain permanent leverage over one of its most valuable resources. This wasn't just another chapter in an ongoing trade dispute. The confrontation had reached the resource sitting at the very center of the Canada-U.S. relationship. This wasn't lumber, which could eventually be replaced, or manufactured goods, which might one day be produced elsewhere. This was oil. The resource that keeps American refineries running, helps stabilize gasoline prices, and props up a trade relationship Trump has criticized for years without fully acknowledging where much of that imbalance actually comes from. Once again, Washington leaned on the same strategy it had used throughout the dispute. The assumption was simple. Because Canada sells so much oil to the United States, that dependence would eventually force Ottawa to accept American terms. But that logic had already failed with other strategic resources, and this time it would fail again. Because Mark Carney understood exactly where the real leverage was. Early that morning, the U.S. Department of Energy and the Office of the United States Trade Representative delivered a joint proposal to the Canadian government. The document called for guaranteed, discounted, and priority access to Canadian crude oil exports, pipeline capacity, and key energy infrastructure. It contained 3 major demands. First, Canada would lock in discounted crude prices for the next 10 years, preventing it from negotiating better terms even if global markets shifted. Second, pipeline capacity would be reserved for American refiners ahead of future export projects serving Asia or Europe, effectively limiting Canada's ability to diversify its customer base. Third, the United States sought investment access to Canadian pipelines, storage terminals, and processing facilities through arrangements that had never before been negotiated between the two countries. Taken together, the proposal followed the exact blueprint Washington had already applied to uranium, potash, natural gas, and electricity: secure long-term pricing, preserve America's position as the primary customer, and expand influence over strategic infrastructure. In effect, the goal was to turn a Canadian sovereign resource into a permanent American strategic advantage. But this request landed on the desk of a prime minister who had already turned down similar proposals before. And once again, Mark Carney's answer would be exactly the same. What made this confrontation different was the timing. Oil wasn't just another resource, it was the very commodity Trump had just claimed America no longer needed from Canada. Yet within days, his own administration was formally asking for guaranteed, discounted access to that same oil supply for the next decade. The contradiction was impossible to miss. If Canadian energy truly wasn't important, why was Washington working so hard to lock it down? That question became the defining issue of the entire dispute, and Ottawa was about to give its answer. Now let's turn to Ottawa, because this is where the story takes its decisive turn. At 2:14 that afternoon, Mark Carney stepped in front of reporters alongside Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources and the head of the Canada Energy Regulator. That lineup alone signaled something important. This wasn't going to be an emotional political rebuttal. Canada intended to answer the American proposal as a matter of national policy, regulatory authority, and energy sovereignty, not political theater. Carney got straight to the point. He confirmed that Canada had reviewed the joint proposal submitted by the U.S. Department of Energy and the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Then he delivered Canada's answer in a single word: no. From there, he laid out exactly why. The first request, a 10-year guarantee of discounted Canadian crude Astounded, would permanently weaken Canada's standing in global energy markets by stripping away its ability to respond to future market conditions. No major energy-producing nation would willingly accept those restrictions, he argued, and Canada wouldn't be the first. Carney also pointed to the contradiction sitting at the heart of Washington's position. Just days earlier, the same administration had publicly claimed it didn't need Canadian energy. Now it was requesting guaranteed access to that very same resource for the next 10 years. As he put it, you can't tell the public something has no value while privately working to lock it down for a decade. Canadians would notice that inconsistency, and so would the rest of the world. He then turned to the second demand. Giving American refiners permanent priority over Canada's pipeline capacity would effectively shut down the country's long-term strategy of expanding exports to Asia and Europe. Canada had spent years building infrastructure designed to reduce its reliance on a single customer, and Carney made it clear Ottawa had no intention of giving up that flexibility now. The third request sought broader American investment access to Canadian pipelines, storage facilities, and processing infrastructure. Carney called it just another version of the same proposal Washington had already pushed in talks involving uranium, potash, and natural gas. Canada's answer hadn't changed. Strategic energy infrastructure would stay under Canadian control, and it would not be pried open through trade pressure. After rejecting each demand, Carney announced 3 immediate steps that would shape Canada's path forward. First, he directed the Canada Energy Regulator to begin reviewing expanded export licensing aimed at increasing shipments to Asian and European markets, cutting down Canada's dependence on any single customer. Second, he confirmed that negotiations with 2 Asian refining consortiums had already been quietly underway for months and would now move forward faster. According to Carney, the American proposal had actually strengthened Canada's case for speeding up those talks. Third, Ottawa activated its energy sovereignty framework, establishing that any future foreign investment in Canadian pipelines, terminals, or related infrastructure would be judged first against Canada's own energy security and diversification priorities, not the interests of any one trading partner. That announcement reinforced a message Carney had repeated throughout the broader trade dispute. Canada's energy resources exist to serve Canada's national interests first. The United States remains an important customer, but it's no longer the only factor shaping Ottawa's long-term decisions. No request from Washington, no matter how forcefully delivered, will override Canada's responsibility to manage its own resources on its own terms. Markets reacted almost immediately. Prices tied to Canadian heavy crude edged higher as traders began pricing in the possibility that discounted oil supplies to American refiners might become less certain in the years ahead. Analysts also turned their attention to refining margins across the U.S. Midwest, where many facilities lean heavily on lower-cost Canadian crude. Inside Washington, reactions split along familiar lines. Lawmakers from refining states began hearing renewed concerns from energy companies worried about that same contradiction Carney had pointed to: an administration that publicly insisted it didn't need Canadian oil, while privately pushing for guaranteed discounted access to it for the next 10 years. By the end of the day, the inconsistency Carney had called out in Ottawa had become a central topic of private conversation across the American energy sector. From here, the story branches into 3 very different paths, each carrying its own consequences for the future of North American energy. The first is the most optimistic. The gap between Washington's public statements and its private demands becomes too obvious to defend politically. Faced with mounting scrutiny, the administration quietly withdraws its proposal within the next month. Canada, meanwhile, keeps moving ahead with its regulatory review and its push to expand exports to Asian and European markets, since those plans were already in motion. The American request simply gave Ottawa a stronger public reason to speed them up. The second possibility is far more confrontational. Instead of backing down, Washington responds by threatening tariffs aimed specifically at Canadian energy imports. A move like that would immediately raise costs for refineries across the American Midwest, putting lawmakers from those states on a collision course with the White House as fuel prices start climbing. Canada, in turn, pushes ahead with its Asian negotiations, turning preliminary talks into long-term supply agreements. Over time, a portion of Canadian crude that once flowed almost automatically into the United States begins heading elsewhere. In doing so, Canada proves that the discounted oil American refiners had relied on for decades was never actually guaranteed. It only existed as long as the relationship stayed mutually beneficial. The third scenario reaches even further into the future. Rather than reacting to a single proposal or a single administration, Canada gradually reshapes its entire export strategy over several years. The regulatory decisions announced this week become the starting point for a much broader transformation. Canadian oil increasingly reaches multiple international buyers instead of depending so heavily on one customer. Pipeline infrastructure becomes more flexible. Export options expand. Regulatory decisions consistently put Canadian energy security and long-term diversification ahead of the convenience of any single trading partner. In that future, Canada comes out of the dispute with more buyers, more negotiating power, and an energy strategy built around choice instead of dependence. So what does Carney's refusal really mean? It means this dispute was never just about one proposal or one day's headlines. Donald Trump spent the week sending two completely different messages. Publicly, he argued that America didn't need Canadian energy. Privately, his administration requested guaranteed discounted access to that same energy for the next decade. Carney refused to let those two narratives sit side by side. He didn't respond with anger or political theatrics. Instead, he answered through regulatory policy, documented decisions, and a clear explanation of why Canada's position wasn't going to change. He called out the contradiction in the open before Washington had any chance to quietly move past it. At its core, this comes down to sovereignty. Canadian oil powers American refineries, but Canada decides where that oil goes, what price it sells for, and which infrastructure carries it. Throughout this trade dispute, Mark Carney has argued that Canada's resources, transportation networks, payment systems, and strategic industries exist first and foremost to serve Canadian interests. This latest decision follows that exact principle. Oil helped build the modern Canada-U.S. relationship, and Carney made it clear it would not become a bargaining chip controlled by someone else. The message delivered in Ottawa wasn't aimed only at Washington. It was heard by governments, investors, and energy markets around the world, all watching closely to see how a country responds when one of its most valuable exports gets dismissed in public, while being quietly pursued behind closed doors. What happens next will determine far more than the outcome of a single trade dispute. The decisions made over the coming weeks could reshape the entire North American energy relationship. If Washington quietly withdraws its demand, Canada is unlikely to walk back the diversification strategy it has already begun. If the United States chooses to escalate instead, Ottawa now has both the political justification and the regulatory framework to accelerate its shift toward new markets. And if that broader transformation keeps building, this moment may eventually be remembered as the point when Canada's energy strategy permanently moved beyond dependence on a single customer. That's why Carney's refusal carries weight far beyond one day's headlines. This wasn't simply a rejection of an American proposal. It was a statement about how Canada intends to manage its most valuable natural resources for years to come. Donald Trump publicly argued that the United States didn't need Canadian energy, yet his administration simultaneously sought guaranteed discounted access to that same energy for the next decade. Rather than answering with political rhetoric, Carney responded through regulatory policy, documented decisions, and a clear, steady explanation of Canada's position. In doing so, he pulled the contradiction into the open before it could quietly slip out of the conversation. At its core, this story has always been about sovereignty. Canadian oil may fuel American refineries, but Canada keeps the authority to decide where that oil goes, what price it commands, and which infrastructure carries it to market. Since the start of this trade dispute, Carney has consistently argued that Canada's energy resources, transportation networks, strategic industries, and critical infrastructure exist first and foremost to serve Canadian interests. His response to Washington followed that same principle. The resource that helped build the modern Canada, U.S. relationship would not become a permanent strategic asset controlled through outside pressure. The message delivered in Ottawa wasn't directed only at Washington. It was heard by governments, investors, energy companies, and commodity markets around the world, all watching to see what happens when a country refuses to let one of its most valuable exports be dismissed publicly while being treated as indispensable behind closed doors. Canada's position was simple. Its resources belong to Canada. Its infrastructure will be governed by Canadian law, and decisions about its energy future will be made in Ottawa, not anywhere else. That principle now sits at the center of every major resource negotiation between the two countries, and its consequences are likely to extend well beyond this single dispute.